Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Doar, the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm very glad to have you with us today to talk about Phil Gramm's great book, The Myth of American Inequality, How Government Biases Policy Debate, which is available out front. Before coming to AEI, I was the Commissioner of Social Services in New York State for Mike Bloomberg and for George Pataki, so I have a deep interest and involvement in issues concerning how we evaluate the success of our programs helping people who are struggling in America. And we're going to talk about the poverty measure and inequality and upward mobility in this conversation. Karl Rove is a hard act to follow, but we're going to do our best here. For those who don't know, Senator Gramm was a United States Senator, a member of the House of Representatives, Vice Chair of UBS. He's a frequent Wall Street Journal contributor, and best of all, he's also an AEI scholar. So, Senator, it's great to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Robert.
The principal thesis of the book, or the sort of the catch-you point, is the data that we think we know is right actually isn't right at all.
Oh, that's right.
And so tell us about that. Tell us about that thesis about government data that tells us one thing that isn't really the truth.
Well, let me first thank you all for staying this late in the program. I was chairman of Commerce State Justice Appropriations, which has oversight over the Commerce Department and the census. At the same time, I was doing Gramm-Rudman, working on trying to control government spending. And it struck me in that 2-year period that the numbers we had in the budget for expenditures, especially going to low-income individuals, seemed gigantic as compared to the census estimates of household income that broke household income down into quintiles. And I started looking at it, but then I got busy thinking I had bigger fish to fry, and I was able to get on the finance committee, and I sort of let the idea go. And then in 2017, a guy at the University of Chicago, Bruce Meyer, did a comprehensive study in looking at what people who were poor in America consumed in 1980 and compared that to what people who are defined as poor today are consuming, and concluded by that definition that only about 3%, not 14% of the population of the United States was poor. And so when I read that study, I went back to the census data, and the census every year puts out a fundamental building block of American statistics called household income. And in 2017, they put out the household income numbers and broke the country into quintiles. So the bottom 20%, second, the middle income, fourth, and the top quintile. And in 2017, the bottom 20% of households in America were spending on a similar report put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics twice as much as their income. The second 20% were spending 11% more than their income, and the top 20% were saving almost 55% of their income, even though there was no evidence that we had anything like that level of thrift in America. So I put together a little team, including a former assistant commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics under 2 presidents, and we decided to take a close look at census data. So one more boring fact, and then we can get into stuff more interesting. In 1947, when the Census Bureau started putting out data on household income, almost everybody was paid in cash or cash equivalent. There weren't many payments in kind. Most people didn't get fringe benefits at work. and government paid welfare and paid other benefits in cash. And so counting only cash income was about 97% correct in 1947. But by 1965, when the war on poverty started, and 1967, when funding ramped up, almost all that funding was payment in kind. You didn't get cash. You got a debit card for food stamps. And so to make a long story short, we found that the census had never changed its definition of income, that it does not count 2/3 of all transfer payments as income to people who got the transfers. And let me just give you an example of some of the things. Food stamps, where you get a debit card from the Treasury and you buy groceries and the government pays your bill. Medicaid, where you get health care and government pays your health care bill. The Census Bureau does not take into account taxes, so it doesn't count refundable tax credits, even where you get a check from the Treasury, as income.
So just to stop you there for a second, because as I mentioned, I was the Commissioner of Social Services in New York City. I spent most of my career working in programs to try to help people get out of poverty. Those programs include the SNAP program, the food stamp program which Senator Gramm just mentioned. They include the Earned Income Tax Credit. They include public health insurance. They include housing assistance. And we implemented them in an effort to help people escape poverty. And every year, the federal government would tell us that we were making no progress because they weren't counting the things we were doing and that were enacted in law by Republicans and Democrats in order to fight poverty. Now, why would it be, just starting from, we'll look at the left and then we'll look at the right, why would it be that they wouldn't want to let us know the progress we were making? Why would people, I know you don't want to get into questioning people's motives, but why would the government or why would anyone in America want to be able to keep saying we still have 20% of American children with resources in their household less than the official poverty rate? Why would they say that?
Let me quickly define, when you correct all this, what you find. First of all, the poverty rate fell dramatically from 1947 to 1967. And then from 1967, the poverty rate for all practical purposes did not change for 50 years. It oscillated between about 14.5% and 11%, depending on the state, the official poverty that put out by the Census Bureau. Why was that the case? Because while the census didn't count 2/3 of all transfer payments as income to people that got the transfers, it didn't count 88% of the transfer payments that went to poor people because they were payments in kind. They weren't in cash. So the net result is, whereas the census says that the poverty rate in America is about 12%, when you count all of the transfer payments as income to people that receive the transfer payments, the poverty rate is between 2 and 3% in America. Also, the Census Bureau says doesn't count taxes, so in looking at the income of upper income Americans, it's comparing their gross income where taxes are not taken into account, hence the massive savings rate implied by federal statistics. And so the Census Bureau says the top 20% of all American earners or income recipients has 16.7 times as much income as the bottom 20%. We show, using government data, every figure in this book is from the federal government. They calculate the data, they just don't use it. We show that when you count all transfer payments as income to people that got the transfer payments, if you count all taxes as income that people lost in taxes, that the ratio of the top 20% to the bottom 20% in income is not 16.7 to 1, but 4 to 1. Now, you can say 4 to 1's too much, but it's a completely different debate than the debate between 14 to 1, 16.7 times and 4 times. Finally, and I think the most stunning thing, and I'll let you go.
Yeah.
All right, the most stunning thing is you've heard everywhere that we've got growing inequality in America, that it's a threat to our system, that you hear it from conservatives, you hear it from liberals. We show conclusively in this book, using government data, that if you count all transfer payments as income to people who receive them and taxes as income lost to people who paid them, that income inequality is lower today than it was in 1947. We are having a debate about destroying the economic system of this country that is based on figures that are verifiably false.
So you went right to inequality before we had finished in poverty, and I want to just go back to the point that I think does need to be made, and that is, if you are advocating for more expenditures and more transfer payments for people at the bottom, it's not helpful if you're doing it at a time when actually enormous amount of progress has happened and the poverty rate is much closer to 3%, as Bruce Meyer and you say, than what the official statistic is. On the other hand, on the right, President Reagan wasn't really right now, you'd have to say, in saying that we fought a war on poverty and poverty won. You'd have to say that sometimes even people on the right don't want to acknowledge this progress we've made in raising the incomes at the bottom. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's fair. I think it's clear that Reagan didn't know. In 1980, I didn't know what these numbers were.
Okay.
But it is clear that if your objective in the war on poverty was to eliminate want, we won that war. But, as I point out, and I know you're going to get to later, that the price we paid as in 1967, we were providing funding at roughly $10,000 worth of benefits for the average household in the bottom 20% of income earners. Today, that amount is roughly $50,000.
Yeah.
During that same period, the percentage of prime work age persons that are in the bottom 20% of American earners who actually work fell from 67% to 36%. So we won the war on need, but at a cost of indolence. And as a result, these people lost their access to the American dream.
Now, one other point that you have to make in looking at this data is that the standard, which has been consistent over many years, the minimum level to help you be out of poverty as defined by the federal government, is still pretty low. People in those circumstances are struggling. They're facing difficulties. But your purpose in your book is to say, fine, that's worthy of considering. We ought to examine that. But let's be honest about the data. Let's make sure we're telling the truth about the real poverty level in America. And similarly, the truth about the real inequality level in America. So I just want to be clear. I think so many people, when we talk about properly measuring the real condition of people's income, we're not acknowledging that people at the bottom still face troubles and difficulties, and there are things we should do for them, but we shouldn't view them as being solved by more transfer payments that will just continue to raise their income, but and here's the point, maybe disincentivize work. And so tell us a little bit about your sense
first of all,
of work versus non-workers versus workers and their relative standard of relative income, because this was one of the major findings of your book that made a little news when it came out and got some attention. The Journal wrote about it, other newspapers wrote about it. What was that finding?
Well, the point is, we need to get our facts straight. We don't argue in the book that we're spending too much on welfare. We don't argue that we're spending too little. We just simply argue that we're not measuring what is actually happening in America. When when President Biden proposed doubling the child tax credit, saying it would cut the child poverty rate in half, I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal saying it won't. It won't change the poverty rate. And sure enough, when the Congress provided the doubling the child tax credit, the Census Bureau came out with their number, the poverty rate didn't change because they didn't count the refundable tax credit. Right. And there was such a brouhaha about it that the census put out a supplemental measure saying if we had counted the refundable tax credit, it would have reduced child poverty. The point being, for 50 years, we have had the argument that we need to do more to help people. We do more to help people. Census doesn't count it. Then 5 years later, we have the same argument again. We do more, the census doesn't count it. And we have reached the point where one of the major findings of the book, and the first thing that I published in the Wall Street Journal, is that the bottom 60% of American earners, that is, the bottom quintile, the second quintile, and the middle income quintile, when you adjust for transfer payments and taxes, basically earn the same income. So this creates huge political implications. It's sort of, in my opinion, explanation for modern populism. You've got people who are working, husband and wife working, they're barely making ends meet. Somebody down the street's not breaking a sweat and is as well off as they are. They resent it. It has nothing to do with racism or bigotry or anything else. It's just unjust. And so, again, we stay away from the politics. And the principal argument of the book is, let's get our facts straight. Now, we go from there into many different areas, but
this question about workers versus non-workers and their relative income status in neighborhoods and communities around America is politically charged.
Certainly is.
And I'll just give you a sense of how it played out. During the child tax credit debate, President Biden and the Democrats said, we just want to add more, and sure, it's going to go to non-workers, but that's okay. And they thought they were going to win. They had the Democratic Senate. This was back when the Democrats had the House. And they were sure they were going to win. But when others, you and others, and people at AI and others, raised this issue of rewarding non-work, additionally rewarding non-work, and discouraging work, and compared it to people that work all the time, and these are similarly situated people, high school degree, no more, who are working all the time and not doing much better, that turned out to be politically very, very powerful. And they ended up, Senator Manchin switched and said, I can't support that. There was a referendum in Wisconsin during a time when the Democrats swept the state, but they asked people, do you think people should have to work in return for assistance? In the state of Wisconsin, the number was 65% said yes. So it is, we have done a lot. And we've raised up incomes for people at the bottom, but we may have discouraged work in the process and made people in America less comfortable with our efforts to help the poor.
Well, I would say even more than that. We've had a dramatic decline in the number of poor people, able-bodied, prime work age, that actually work. And as a result, they've never become part of the American economic system. We have, in essence, disengaged poor people from the economic process in America with our welfare program. And one of the arguments of the book is the two largest reasons for difference in earned income inequality, that is what you make by working, is do you work? Because if you don't work, you don't develop talents, you don't get on the economic escalator, and you miss the benefits of living in the most productive society in history. And then secondly, how sharp are your tools? Education. Those are two really important factors.
So we're going to come back to those in a minute, but there's a third. When I was working in New York, we used to say there are three things we want to focus on One is poverty alleviation. Another was we had some sense of what was the inequality question, which you've talked about already. And the third was the one we thought was most important, and that was the ability to move up. If you're born at the bottom, is there opportunity in America, is there opportunity in our city or our state for people who are born at the bottom to, as they grow up, to move up into the middle or the top quintile? So you do a whole nother chapter on that, and you call it the American Dream is Alive and Well. So tell us a little bit about the prospects for people born at the bottom and their ability to move up in the United States.
Well, first of all, you've all heard that if you're poor in America, the system is rigged against you. It's a standard political line. It is totally and verifiably false. 91% of all people who are born and grow up in bottom quintile families end up doing better as adults than their parents. That number falls to 70% for people who are born in the top quintile. And when you look at mobility, in relative mobility, how do children do that are born and grow up in the bottom 20%? 61% of them move into an income quintile above their parents. And when you compare their income to their parents' income, the mobility is overwhelming. So we basically give America a bad rap that to be born in America is sort of, except for rare exceptions, is a destiny of poverty and lack of opportunity, when the data is overwhelming that people are not only escaping poverty but achieving prosperity all over the country. And there is no evidence, none whatsoever, that that process has slowed down. Now, people argue, is 61% that actually move up too low? And when you look at the numbers, if you adjust for the people who've dropped out of the labor market, that is a large explanation of why the number is not bigger. And then you look at the decline in the quality of public education, K through 12, in the inner city schools. Those two factors are major factors if you want more people to succeed in America who start from the very bottom. Require able-bodied people to work and incentivize them to work, and improve the quality of primary and secondary education. And if you look at the data, the way to do that is school choice.
So I want to emphasize that first point that Senator Gramm made. So again, the 14,000 employees who work for me in New York City, a big chunk of them provided benefits in the process of an application process for SNAP or public health insurance. And the rules of those two programs, which don't have much work emphasis, or really no work emphasis, were that when you saw someone across the table and they said, I'm in need of food stamps or I'm in need of public health insurance because I'm not working, I have no earnings, the rules of those programs in the United States now have been for some time, well, that's not my job to worry about your earnings. My job is to give you aid and see you in a year or maybe 2 years. Here's the card, see you later. And what Senator Gramm is saying is that's really not helping them. That's leaving them in a situation that is very likely to be poor and struggling and not on the path to upward economic prosperity or getting into the middle class. And so these debates in Washington about work requirements, which you've heard and which are very prominent and make some people uncomfortable and get everybody all riled up, work requirements, it's not just a work requirement on the individual seeking aid, it's also on the government agency providing aid. They ought to have some requirement to try to help the person in a way that really gets them started, and that is employment. So I think sometimes, again, on these debates concerning people at the bottom, Republicans aren't always the best at making these cases. You are one of the best, but there aren't enough of you probably in the Republican Party. But that's what this is about. It's about helping people move forward through employment and not through assistance only.
Well, listen, the best jobs program, the best housing program, the best education program is a job. When you incentivize people to quit working, they get off the escalator. National income doubled in the last 25 years. But if you weren't part of the economy, it didn't happen to you. And so you're just dependent on what somebody else is going to give you. And I used to try to explain to my mama, neither of my parents graduated from high school. My brother was the first person in my extended family to graduate from high school. He graduated from college. And I used to try to explain to my mama, we're lucky these programs didn't exist when I was growing up, because I wouldn't be where I am. And my mother, of course, would say, don't you ever suggest that I would have taken welfare, because I wouldn't have. And I'd say, well, Mother, everybody you know would be taking it. There would be people knocking on your door saying you're hurting the economy by not taking it. All your relatives would have been taking it. You would have taken it. Not my mother. But the point being, we're not, if your goal is to help people become your equal in terms of being able to do what you do, not somebody you're going to take care of, but somebody who's going to compete with you, you've got to get them in the economy and become part of it. And I'm a firm believer that there is extraordinary talent in ordinary people that is not discovered in America. So that's.
I also should point out that this thing about economic opportunity in the United States, one of the great benefits that New York City benefited from in the late 90s and 2000 was an influx of immigrants from around the world.
Yeah, that's right.
And they were coming for the opportunity that was being provided in the United States. And that was what they wanted to get in, and that was through employment. But I did want to say, you have a whole other section about national income and growth, and you have a more positive story. One thing I want to say is that there's a lot of this book that makes you feel good about the last 50 years. And where are you on that? Where are you on, and where is the book on this rhetoric about falling wages, economic prospects in America have gone backwards? Where are you on that?
Well, let me tell you where the facts are. Real wages, when you count fringe benefits and you use the most accurate consumer price index, have risen rapidly in the last 50 years. We have lived in a golden age, and there has been a widespread growth and prosperity, and there has been a broad sharing of the cornucopia of goods and services that we produced. The last 50 years, in every ethnic group, in every racial group, in every part of the country, and we provide hard data on the section on the last 50 years, has made extraordinary progress. The only group that has not shared in that progress are the people who've dropped out of the labor market. But our country has performed an extraordinary task, and I'm hoping that we're going to live through another golden age such as we've had in the last 50 years.
Just to stress that even more, your book came out kind of, COVID was a big setback, and we had to get around that and survive that and work through that. But we were, black unemployment, black child poverty, Hispanic child poverty, unemployment were really reaching historic lows.
Yeah, there were.
COVID hit. It's now back the same way. That opportunity is out there now. Real wages are rising. So this is not a story of history. This is also a story of the present. But having said all that, Senator Gramm, some members of your party are Senator Hawley, Senator Vance, former President Trump. They tell a different, darker story about the economic prospects for Americans, especially Americans with a high school degree or no more, or Americans who worked in manufacturing. What's going on there?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that the value of a college education has grown very rapidly. If you look at what what the differential between a high school graduate and a college graduate on average was 30 years ago, it is substantially more than that today. A failure of the education system is one of the great failures in this country. And the people who don't go to college or go to college that aren't prepared and therefore can't and don't major in things that really pay end up being disadvantaged in the competition of life. It's like my mother, who nursed in the hospital the first shift and nursed rich people in the second shift in their homes. She would come home and say, you know the difference between rich people and us? They work harder than we do, and they got sharper tools. And what does she mean by sharper tools? They were better educated. And the same is true today. But the point is, even people that didn't go to college, high school graduates today are about as well off as college graduates were 50 years ago. It's very instructive, and if any of y'all are close to my age, let me move this so I don't knock it over. I urge you to go back and look in the house you grew up in. Go back and look at I threw the newspaper as a boy in the richest part of Columbus, Georgia. And I remember my mother, when we would drive past Dr. Dykes' house, which is a nice house in town, would slow down, stick her finger out the window and say, if you work hard, you can have a house like that. I wouldn't live in doctor houses, I wouldn't live in that house today. I mean, you're going to be amazed. We forget what great progress we've made, and we don't give our country credit for it.
Okay, so you dodged my question a little bit, so I'm going to come back to it one more time.
All right.
Some of this debate among conservatives, and it's a serious division in the Republican Party, concerns a new kind of industrial policy.
Yeah, I know, and it's completely, look, if industrial policy worked, we would have torn down the Berlin Wall to have gotten into Eastern Europe. The idea that we're going to compete with China by adopting China's policies is ridiculous. America works because freedom works. You set ordinary people free, and they do extraordinary things. And I don't care what party you're a member of, if you want government to decide where money is invested and where jobs are created, you're not on the same side of the debate as me. I watched government my entire life. I was an economist. I studied government. I was in the belly of the beast for 25 years. I know the private sector works. I know government doesn't work. Government needs to do a limited number of things and do them well, and let the private sector create jobs, growth, and opportunity to pay for it all. And Republicans that are arguing for trade policy are basically arguing for socialism dressed up in business clothes.
Okay, so you're not for trade barriers, and there are tremendous benefits to low-income Americans from a global trade system.
Look, low-income Americans benefit from high growth.
Yeah.
They don't benefit from some industrial policy that subsidizes a privileged few. They benefit from strong economic growth that makes it possible for them to get on the playing field and compete.
So at the end of the book, you make some recommendations regarding disincentives to work and work requirements. We've talked about those, and you've referred to the second group, I did want to sort of stress that one more time. So K through 12 education, you acknowledge that for low-income Americans, there's a disaster there. There's a problem.
Exactly.
And what is the solution that you've...
Well, look, I don't know that school choice is the be-all and end-all. There may be a better system. But there is hard evidence to show that school choice improves performance. And I don't, how many people, I want to ask the number. I was the only member of the Senate, by the way. They had a child in public schools in the District of Columbia. But our children are in private schools, our grandchildren are in private schools. Why? Because they can get a better education. And if the state of Texas is providing $10,000 or $12,000 per student with the goal of educating children, why not let their parents decide where they go to school? And that's a big debate we're having in Texas. And hopefully it's going to be successful.
So
But the evidence is overwhelming. It may not be the best, there may be something better out there, but it's the only thing that has proven to be not only effective, but very effective.
Yeah, and I would also just say, and I know for this audience, you're well aware of the success of the charter school movement in New York City, especially led by Eva Moskowitz of Success Academy. She has one of the largest school districts in the country now, 20,000 students, largely low income, largely minority kids, and she's outperforming every other school in the state. Every other school, not other charter schools, not other schools serving poor kids, every other one. And so that is a sign of progress that can be made when you free up the opportunities for parents to make their own choices and schools to run their systems in a way unencumbered by the teachers union, honestly. So if you're talking about helping poor kids, Eva Moskowitz and Success Academy and other people that run schools like that are really doing more than those who want to increase transfer payments to low-income families.
Well, look, you're doing a lot more by helping people get a good primary and secondary education where they can compete than getting them into Harvard when they can't.
Okay, so we didn't get to quite the number of laughs that Karl Rove got, but we've covered a lot of data and we've covered it seriously. But just to summarize, the poverty rate in the United States, properly measured, is not 16%, it's closer to 3%. And I do want to point out what Senator Gramm is saying when he says that is widely accepted. Recently, the New York Times did a story in which the official poverty measure was cited without any provisos. And Jason Furman, the former chairman of the Council on Economic Advisors for President Obama, very strongly condemned that kind of rhetoric
I
about
presented
poverty.
this at Harvard, and he was there.
Yes, yes. So that's not something that serious people disagree with. Poverty in the United States.
Nobody disputes the numbers in this book.
That's right. Inequality, not 16 to 1, top 20% versus the bottom 20%, more like 4 to 1. Upward mobility, 60, 65, 70% of people born at the bottom escape the bottom, move up into the middle, or even for up to about, I think, 6 or 7% up to the top. It's not perfect. It's maybe not what you would want if it was everybody was the same, but there's a lot more upward mobility than people recognize. So I had to reiterate that because, again, in the popular media, this isn't necessarily what's accepted, and we want to make sure we drive home the points. But now it's time for questions.
Yeah, just one other point.
Yes, is there
I have a
anything more you
chapter
haven't
on the
said?
super rich.
Yes.
Do they pay their taxes? Yes. Do they contribute? Am I poorer because Bill Gates is richer? Or am I richer because he's richer? And this chapter goes with hard data from the Internal Revenue Service into all of these issues. So I urge you, AEI's bought a book, their gift, take one, but read it. If you read the first chapter, you'll read the whole book.
It is true that in the book you do describe the use of the tax system to provide an enormous amount of aid to low-income Americans through the refundable tax credit system, and also to gather up an enormous amount of revenue from wealthy Americans.
We transfer more income from the top to the bottom than any other country in the world except France.
Yeah, we have a very progressive tax system compared to Europe.
The most progressive tax system in the world.
Okay. Anything else you want to get out?
No.
Okay. See if there are any questions. Right here. Well, they're bringing you a mic.
I think you make an excellent point about the need to incentivize work and to
Pull
get,
it a little closer. I'm old and deaf.
Okay,
repeat it
I think you make an excellent point about the need to incentivize work get people into the system. But that brings up the whole question of the minimum wage. And I wanted to, a standard argument is that the minimum wage is really low and hasn't risen much, vis-a-vis inflation in recent decades. So I just want to give you a chance to respond to that kind of mainstream argument.
Well, minimum wages don't work. They cut off the bottom rung of the ladder. Every place you walk into today's got a help wanted sign. And nobody's paying the minimum wage, they're paying above it. Once when I was in the Senate and in a kind of a mean mood, there was a motion to raise the minimum wage. So I offered an amendment to have $100 an hour. And of course, the Democrats just went berserk. And so I said, well, why are we being so tight? If we really want to help people, hell, let's put everybody in the top quintile. We'll just have a minimum wage of $100 an hour. Well, the problem is there's a quirk in arithmetic. Anything times 0 is 0. So finally, I relented and took the amendment down. But the point is, minimum wage doesn't work. People earn ultimately on their ability to produce. If you want to help people make money, help them acquire skills that are valuable. As I tell my grandchildren, if you want to make vast amounts of money, become indispensable to somebody who's got vast amounts of money.
So I would just add a little bit more to that based on my experience in New York. We have higher minimum wages in New York than in other parts of the country. The concern that I had was that given that we rewarded work for people that worked at lower wages, but not enough to make them as solid as possible. So that's where the refundable tax credit comes in, or food stamp benefits for working people. That increases the reward for work that makes work pay, as President Clinton used to say. And it's an enormously effective way to incentivize work through not just requiring work, but also rewarding work. It distributes the burden of doing that across all of us, not just the individual employer. But more importantly, if you raise minimum wages up to certain levels, employers will not hire the most vulnerable people in our city.
Exactly.
People coming home from prison, people who have very serious difficulties and have had problems, people that don't look like the employer.
Or don't speak good English.
Or don't speak good English. So all of these things, in my opinion, given that we reward work through these transfer payments that are supportive to low-income working Americans, would, in my opinion, be detrimental to the lowest, most struggling New Yorkers. So I'm completely with Senator Gramm on higher minimum wages end up being harmful to low-income Americans. And I remember when I first went to AAI, I did a policy on how to help low-income Americans, a higher EITC or a minimum wage. And the people who came to defend a minimum wage said very explicitly, well, wait a minute, I want to be clear. This is not an anti-poverty program. We're not really interested. That's not what we're focused on. But that's what I was most focused on, and that's what I think most Americans care most about, is people at the bottom and helping them move up.
Yeah, at the beginning, minimum wages were supported by northern textile manufacturers who were worried that textile mills were moving to the south. Minimum wage has really never been a poverty program of any kind.
Yes, sir. Right there.
Senator, I congratulate you on taking these myths on and doing it well and writing this book. But what about something that's not a myth, and that is the uncontrolled government spending, the Social Security, Medicaid, the things that are going to bankrupt the country? How do you tried to get a handle on that at one time, and I know you've been at that battle, but how do we get a handle on that?
Well, listen, I dedicated 25 years of my life in Washington trying to gain control of government spending. You can't have unlimited government and unlimited opportunity. You have to choose. We're going to have to make some tough decisions. I mean, today, I thought about it when Carl was talking. Both Biden and Trump say, I'm not going to touch Social Security. Well, look, Social Security in 8 years will have an automatic reduction of about 30% in benefits if you don't touch it. So who the hell's for that? So we're going to have to touch it. I was there when we touched it. I'm the only living person who has ever cut a Social Security benefit. I killed 3 of them in one day. Why? Because Social Security was going broke, because it threatened my mama's Social Security. And we raised the retirement age on a prospective basis, so nobody drawing benefits was affected. I'm still working. I lie and say I have a young wife who wants money and she'd put me in a cheap nursing home. But the truth is I like working. It's sort of who I am. And we're going to have to incentivize old people to keep working if they can and they want to. I don't understand why I still have to pay Social Security and Medicare when I'm 80 years old. I have to pay those taxes. Now, it doesn't affect me, but it would affect a lot of people. So we're going to have to do a lot of things. And unfortunately, it's going back to 1981 and 83 when we did this before. We didn't do it until it was a crisis. It would be so much easier to do it. Or we almost, with Bill Clinton, convinced him to go when we had the big surplus to an investment-based Social Security for young people. But in the end, it had such profound political effect. If you got a retirement program, you need an investment advisor. If you got Social Security, you need a politician. And there's a big damn difference. And so we got some hard choices to make, but look, and I say this with at least total belief in what I'm saying. We don't have a problem in America we can't solve. We got more tools than anybody's ever had. We've got untapped resources. We got human talent that's never been discovered. I used to say to Reagan, we had this sort of game. I was the author of the Reagan program in the House. And I would say to the president things like, did you see the statistics today on disability payments? He'd not seen them. I would say, like, the number of people drawing disability declined dramatically last month. People are getting up out of wheelchairs and going to work.
Yeah.
Okay, it was a little bit of an exaggeration, but the facts were there. So we can do these things, but we're going to have to make some hard choices.
Yeah, and I would just add, as the former poverty fighter, the deficit and debt problem is not caused by programs that are directed at low-income Americans. They're caused by Medicare, Medicaid, which is public health insurance for low-income Americans. That's a big problem, and Social Security. But all the other programs are really small compared to what is really causing the problem. Okay, one last. Yes, sir.
I want to thank you for coming here today. It's such a relief, being a conservative Texan in Aspen, it's such a relief to see someone, a Texan, number one, and number two, someone who's on maybe a little bit politically in my direction more than most people here. But I found myself today listening to you, and I believe in the work ethic, and I believe in that people who don't work are going to get left behind for personal satisfaction and for their own personal development. And I find so many of these things that you say intuitive, and it was hard for me not to clap all through your thing because it's the way I believe. But it's not felt in this room, or typically at the Aspen Institute and or the Ideas Festival. And I wonder, why is that? Is it a my team versus your team type thing, or why? What I consider to be intuitive and the kind of things you're talking about just don't seem to be resonating with a lot of other folks.
Well, this is your first appearance at the Aspen Ideas. Is that right?
About 20 years ago, I came to the old Aspen Institute. But yeah, look. Part of our problem, a big part of our problem, is we don't have our facts straight. We're talking past each other. And so, look, I know everybody who's ever written a book thinks it's just the most important thing in the world, you read it. This book's not about me. This book's about America. It's a short book, take it and read it. It's just full of facts, but the star of the book is America. And I think people don't understand how successful our system has been. I used to work at UBS. I was vice chairman of the investment bank when I left the Senate. I did good, and then I tried to do well. And bankers would come to me, and these are people who are making a lot of money, and they'd say, well, I want to give back to the system. And I would say to them, well, look, we just did this IPO that allowed a company to expand, creating thousands of jobs. You gave it work. What you're doing is doing more good for the system than you're going to do if you gave the money away. It's like I say about Warren Buffett. He has done more to promote prosperity in America by being the world's greatest investor than he will ever do giving the money away. Bill Gates will not have 1/10 the effect if he gives every penny he made away and does it wisely. It won't have anything like the effect that creating Microsoft had. Again, the real achievements of America that last are the achievements that create growth and opportunity. It's the old giving people fish or teaching them how to fish. And if there are more fish out there, if the pond's bigger, more people have got a chance.
And I would just say, we're very glad to be here, and we appreciate being invited. We do think we provide a little bit of balance, and we also think that if we want to get Americans to come together, it's important to get us together so that we can share in both honest expressions of our views. And the more we do that, the better we'll be. I think we are at the end of time. It says 000 here. That's what I'm supposed to say. It's time for lunch. Thanks for listening.